So now for the rest of this section 6, we'll discuss briefly a few more specialized topics about point defect and small volume defects. First is a topic called defects in amorphous materials. This may sound a bit counterintuitive because an amorphous material by definition is disordered, so how can a disordered material have defects? But actually, if you look at these previous lectures on the defects in quartz, this becomes much clearer how this is possible. Because many of the defects in quartz were purely defined by bond breaking and having impurities and having then non-saturated bonds, also known as dangling bonds. And impurities can of course be present in also in amorphous materials, but also without impurities, this bond breaking kind of defects can be quite relevant. This is sort of the easiest to understand topic of defects in amorphous materials. If you have atoms with broken bonds, then these can be considered defective. So a simple example is silicon. In silicon in equilibrium, all silicon atoms should have 4 bonds. So if you have silicon atoms with 3 bonds, then this can be considered already a coordination defect because the coordination number is not correct. And this is not only academically interesting, but also experimentally detectable. It's with positron measurements, which measure empty volume in materials. Positron measurements have shown that amorphous silicon have had vacancies, that is, the positron lifetime behaves in a way very similar to vacancies in crystalline silicon, which shows that indeed amorphous silicon can be defective. And this vacancy would then mean that the atoms surrounding the empty volume would have probably have a incorrect number of bonds, 3-fold bonded atoms instead of the usual 4-fold. Returning to the silica-like materials, quartz. Actually, one of the key effects of these defects in quartz is that they change the optical properties, and the same is true also in amorphous silica glasses. If you have broken bonds, they can change the optical properties, and a simple consequence of this is that instead of being transparent like regular glass usually is, if you have high concentration of defects, it's no longer transparent. That is, there is a clear optical effect to it. A bit more specialized topic is that also in metals, even though you really don't have covalent bonds and the number of bonds is not so well defined, one can have defects in a transient manner for having by the defect relaxation volume. So there have been a number of computer simulations which have studied time-dependent analysis of defects in amorphous copper, which gave defect relaxation volumes. This is just one example reference of work in that character. Okay, going on, now we'll discuss something which is something between point defects and volume defects. In the beginning of this section 6, we said that 3D defects are volume defects and they can be in principle arbitrarily large. But we'll still discuss them in this section because the borderline between a point and volume defect is actually not so well defined. And the smallest volume defects are very close to point defects. So we'll discuss a few volume defects. The simplest one is a void. That is, you simply have an empty region in a material. And this is one of many picture of voids in materials in the transmission electron microscopy. So in these pictures, the gray area is standard metal, and then these light areas are voids in the metal. And this is something which was in a quite recent work studying nickel and nickel alloys, going all the way to a high entropy alloy, nickel, cobalt, iron, chromium, manganese, compared under 3 MeV nickel irradiation, what kind of structure you had after high dose and a high temperature, 500 degrees C. So using nickel, you have quite big voids. Nickel iron, you have much smaller voids in a different location. And then in this many element high entropy alloys, you'd still have voids, but they are much smaller than in nickel and nickel iron. But in any case, you clearly see that this is void structures which can be quite large. In this case, the largest one are a couple of 100 nanometers, and here the smallest ones are still something of the order of 10, a few nanometers to tens of nanometers. Well, another very important kind of volume defect are the amorphous zones in semiconductors. And this is actually really a key aspect of irradiation of most semiconductors, starting from the regular silicon and germanium, gallium arsenide, and so on. And that is what's observed is that when you irradiate semiconductors, is that the damage which is formed is typically, at least at room and lower temperatures, in disordered zones, which are often called amorphous zones. Now, amorphous means that there is no long-range order, so this is a localized zone. So this calling it amorphous may be slightly misleading, but the point is simply that there is no crystalline structure in these zones. And these are typically 1 to 2 nanometer size in silicon, quite small and difficult to detect, but in germanium and gallium arsenide they are larger. Of course, the size depends on how dense a collision cascade is. If you have heavy ions, you will have larger amorphous zones than with light ions. And here is a couple of images of this from transmission electron microscopy. This is on a large scale. These amorphous zones, in this case in gallium arsenide, look just like black dots, but you clearly see that there is some disorder there. But then if one zooms in high resolution electron microscopy, this is 3 nanometer size scale here. These lines are individual atom planes, so you see individual atom planes. You clearly see that there are disordered zones. These white areas don't have the crystal structure and have a clearly different contrast in this TM image microscopy. And you can see that they are 2 to 3 nanometers in size. And these have been seen many times, and also molecular dynamics simulation can easily reproduce the formation of these disordered zones, as some of the simulations earlier in the course are already shown. Well, a variety of this is that you can have a crystalline zones in an amorphous material, or a locally different crystal structure. And well-known example of this is work done by Steve Sinkel and others some 20 years ago in the late 1990s, where without going into much detail, what they found is that you can zirconia, silicon oxide, can after irradiation and some high temperature annealing, it can decompose into crystalline zirconia and amorphous silicon dioxide. So here you see these white lines here show the region of the crystalline Z02 nanocrystals, and then this in between you have the amorphous silica matrix. So in a sense, this crystalline zirconium dioxide is a volume precipitate in a surrounding amorphous material. And this work was actually quite important because the explanation to the formation of these is that they are formed in heat spikes directly. So this is actually scientifically a very interesting result. And a fourth example, which is much more recent and not yet fully confirmed by experiments, is that the crystal structure can become rather complicated instead of being a simple agglomeration point defect structure. So this work, which has later on been confirmed by many other simulation groups and many other interatomic potentials, shows that look at the interstitial clusters in iron, that the single interstitial is a dumbbell, which we have already mentioned in this course, And then the natural way of building up larger interstitial clusters would be that, okay, going from a dumbbell, you have 2 dumbbells, 3 dumbbells, and so on. And this can indeed geometrically be done, and these defects are stable. However, it turns out that much more complicated crystal structures may actually be more stable than these high energy ones. So here one can get ring-like structure defects, and one can get a new crystalline phase starting to build up instead of these dumbbell structures. And this is the C15 structure, also known as a lace phase crystal structure. So this is actually a special crystalline structure known as a lace phase, which can be macroscopic, but in this case it's a local arrangement of atoms, which corresponds to the C15 structure. It's of course in iron, in pure iron, it's of course not the ground state. The ground state is still BCC, but when you have interstitials, it turns out that the interstitials may be easier to arrange after a few interstitials in this complicated C15 structure instead of just a set of dumbbells. So this is actually something which came as quite surprise just during the last about 5 years, but now it's already seems to be expected, and seems that so-called black dot defects seen in experiments most likely are associated with this C15 lace phase crystal structure. Okay, so that was briefly about volume defects when they are close to the point defect scale. Then we'll still discuss surface defects. First of all, a surface itself can be considered a defect because it breaks the crystal structure of the macroscopic bulk crystal. But if you have a perfect crystal on top of the perfect crystal, you can have different kinds of defects. And what you can have is you can have a surface vacancy, which simply means that you plug out an atom from the surface, but you can also have atoms on top of the surface, which is pretty obvious, and this is known as an adatom. And actually, surface science deals a lot with adatoms. There are many studies of adatoms not related to radiation. But both of these can cluster, so if you have many adatoms, you can talk about an adatom island. And this here is picture shows a single isolated adatom. Here the atoms are colored by height, so these orange atoms are on top. So and here you have one large and one small adatom island on top of the regular FCC surface. And in this case, you actually have a second layer of adatoms here, so you have an adatom island on top of an adatom island. And these were formed of copper by a 50 keV radiation event, by actually a non-trivial coherent displacement event inside the surface from the heat spike. And you can also get craters, and this was mentioned on in the heat spike section. When a heat spike interacts a surface, sometimes they can produce craters, and these craters can be fairly symmetric, or they can have pretty peculiar weird shapes. So sometimes one gets fingers of atoms flowing out from the heat spike, which then land on the surface and can form finger-like structures next to the crater, and sometimes these are also seen in experiments like here. In this experiment, this light area is the crater well, and this black area is the crater rim. In the simulation, we colored the atoms in the same way to show the same structure. And here is an animation of how these craters form. So this is a 50 kV seen on heat spike, and now a segment has been cut out, so you can see inside the crystal. Here you get formation of the heat spike, and after a while the heat spike flows to the surface, and these atoms then flow to the surface in a rather complicated manner. One for a moment has a bridge-like structure here, where you really have a bridge forms on two sides, but this bridge is obviously not stable. It breaks up, and then you have some stuff flying up. You see you have very hot liquid flying up, which then boils away the atoms. and then you have this crater shape forming on the surface, and actually all the atoms fly off. Well, in nanostructures, one can also have surface defects. And in fact, in many nanostructures, because by definition, a nanostructure has lots of surface, these defects can be very, very important for the properties of the entire structure. And a well-known, a much-studied example is are the defects on carbon nanotubes and graphene. And this in a carbon nanotube, you can obviously have vacancies. These were mentioned already. But one can also have an adatom structure, which is rather peculiar and unlike the adatom structure of regular materials. So you can have what happens in this adatom structure is that you actually have three atoms which form a ring, and one of the atoms is then outside the carbon nanotube, well above it. And this similar structure can also be on the inside of the nanotube. And interstitial in the sense that you would have an extra atom in the middle of this ring. If you look at it geometrically, you might imagine that, okay, in the center of the hexagon, you could easily plug in an extra atom. Problem is, if you do this, you would have a carbon atom with 6 bonds, which is certainly not stable. So if you try to do that, the atom immediately leaves and ends up an atom on inside or outside of the tube. On the other hand, these adatoms seem to very much behave like interstitials. And this also exists on graphene and regular graphite by irradiation. It was actually first found in simulations on graphite in the 1990s, where one saw this same triangular defect. The reason this is actually quite important for understanding radiation damage in graphite and graphene is that a single extra atom leads to a huge bump in the electron structure actually on the same place as this. And if you do a scanning tunneling microscopy measurement of irradiated graphite or graphene, this gives a rise to a very high tunneling current out from this extra electronic state. So it actually looks like a very tall feature, although in reality it's only a couple of angstroms high. And as the next to last thing in this section, we'll mention briefly defects in polymers. This is something which is not so well understood in general, but a few things are known. So polymers, of course, are a set of repeating structures, and in this lecture we only take two structures as illustration: polyethylene. So ethylene is a carbon chain with two hydrogen atoms per every carbon. And the easiest way of introducing a bond in polymer is, of course, to break a bond. So if you break one of these bonds, then you get, obviously, you break the polymer and you get chain breaking known as scission, which obviously will affect the bond properties. This can happen, for instance, during electron irradiation or gamma radiation. Just a kick of about 20 eV per atom to one of the carbon atoms is enough to break these bonds and then lead to scission. Then, of course, due to chemical processes, depending on the environment, it may be that these bonds then reform. But it's definitely known this does occur, and they don't always reform. Another defect type, which is not as obvious, but it's very important is for the properties of polymers, is cross-linking. That is, if you have two polymer strands, assume we had here an initial one polyethylene strand and another polyethylene strand, it's possible with some probability that when the bond breaking occurs, you actually link two of the different polymer chains. And this has a major effect on the properties of the polymers. And this is actually sort of an everyday effect. In polymer science, a very key quantity is how much cross-linking there is, and you don't necessarily need any radiation, just purely chemical means can introduce various degrees of cross-linking. And this will, generally speaking, this will harden the material, because then you the different polymer chains can't glide with respect to each other, so they become mechanically harder. And a famous example of irradiation effect and everyday irradiation effects related to cross-linking is that if you take regular rubber boots, leave them in sunshine over the summer, what you observe is that the rubber goes bad. The rubber becomes harder and starts to crack, and eventually and leak water. And the reason to this is that the ultraviolet light from sunlight introduces bond cross-linking, which makes it harder, but at the same time more fragile, and which then leads to cracking and bad properties on it. So it doesn't have to be very exotic. Also, and especially if you have more complicated molecules, you can lead to free motion of free molecules or radicals. This is an example in cellulose that if you have a single atomic recoil which could be introduced by gammas or electron irradiation, you can then kick an atom out, and this can lead to the formation of radicals. In this case, if we run this again, you see that one OH and one CH2 radical were formed in this case. So this here is the OH, and this is the CH2 radical, which were formed in this particular recoil event. And also the rings may break when you have more complicated properties. So this is in cellulose, which has cellulose forms consist of glucose rings with 5 carbon and 1 oxygen atom in the ring. And if you have these recoil events, then you can break some of the bonds here, and this can then obviously change the properties of the structure as well. So this was briefly about defects in polymer materials. One thing I might mention that the simulations showed here were for atomic recoils. What's also very important is electronic excitations. That is, electronic excitations can put bonds into antibonding states and break bonds. And this is the part which is very difficult to model and still not very well understood. But it is clear that can, in many cases, be the dominant mechanism. This is also true in biological materials, which will to some extent be discussed in the next section of this course. And then finally, there are defects which are not atomic at all. So we have polarons are extra electrons in an ionic crystal which are not associated with any atomic defect. And this can be related to these. We already mentioned that extra electrons can be associated with, for instance, the F center, but it's possible in a highly insulating crystals to also have electrons or holes which are not associated with any defect, but they can be experimentally measurable because they modify the polarization effects of the material. And also one can have an excited electronic state which can move in an ionic crystal in the conduction band, and these are called excitons, which are then really moving in the crystal. And also in metals, free electrons can be, if they are in a higher energy state than usual, that they can be considered to form an electronic plasma state, and this is known as a plasmon. And actually these are very important for optical properties of nanocrystals, and something known as the surface plasmon resonance is also used nowadays, for instance, in pharmaceutical field to measure as a means to measure properties of organic molecules or biological molecules when they are attached to a nanoparticle. And also the plasmons are associated with the electronic stopping power. When you have high energy electronic stopping power, it can leaves when a high energy ion moves through crystal, one can consider it leaves a plasmon behind, which then exists for a while. and which then and its properties also contribute to the magnitude of the electronic stopping power. Okay, so this was the end of this section 6. As you saw, studying defects in solids is a big field, and it's a little bit has been split historically between the metal, semiconductor, ceramic, and nanomaterial communities. But here is some good review articles with emphasis on the metals, however, which has been studied most and hence also has been the most systematically reviewed. If you wish to look at defect materials for nanomaterials, Arkady Krasheninnikov, whose name was given somewhere in the lecture note, has written several very good review articles on defects in carbon nanomaterials and 2D materials. And finally, this is what we think are the key things you should have learned in this section. And again, I won't read them aloud, but I'll leave you a couple of minutes to read them. And if you think you haven't learned this, please go back and revise the material.